Good morning, everybody. Welcome back, I guess, if you've been here before,
If you've
to
been tuning in straight since last
yeah.
Saturday.
If you haven't left your computer since last Saturday, man, you
Some weeks it
need
feels like
need to
that
take a
though.
break. Yeah, it does. It feels like I turn this thing off and then it's Saturday again. Welcome,
It
guys.
does.
How are you today? Happy
Yeah,
Doing good.
I hope you
doing
can't hear
good.
my
Couldn't be
dog
happier
just
to spend
barking in the
Saturday with
background.
two other people.
Yeah, I know. We live in
Any
such an
two people, it
isolated
doesn't matter.
world. What?
Just two
Any two
people.
people?
I was kidding.
Any two random people.
Just random
Oh
people.
man, how you guys been this week? You been hacking people,
Actually,
cybersecurity,
interestingly enough,
coding?
I just watched this series on Netflix called Zero Day about
Oh, I
Ooh,
hacking.
saw that. I
It
didn't
was a
watch
good
it, but
one,
I
and it
saw.
was pretty. I mean, they clearly had someone who knows cybersecurity kind of like advise them on this.
really?
Yeah,
That's
yeah, so
cool.
it was pretty cool.
It was
Interesting.
actually like correct information and stuff because that's rare when they do that. I hate when they get that stuff wrong when when you know
No,
what's right and they get it wrong in
it was
movies.
all
It's so
correct
annoying.
information. So like they
That's
weren't
cool.
just
Wow.
throwing out buzzwords.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
I love
very
those.
cool.
I love how there's like a million YouTube videos with people with like the little flipper device thing, and they're like, "I'm a hacker now," and then they try to show off like how they're a hacker with
Yeah.
some store-bought device.
Yeah.
It is funny.
I actually had a locker that I used that was opened with a flipper.
Not hard.
And
Oh, that's what it was, huh?
yeah,
Or you think, yeah,
that's
wow.
what I think. That's what I think. I'm pretty sure it was because
That
how
makes
else would they be
sense.
able to do it? And yeah,
Yeah.
so
Good
Good
those
morning,
morning,
things
Chris.
Chris.
can do damage in certain places. Yeah.
Oh, they
Well,
certainly
they
can, but it's just owning one doesn't make you a hacker, is all I'm
no,
trying
but
to
they're
say.
definitely they're powerful little devices because I mean the
Beats
way
you a
they
little
made
script
them.
kiddie.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
talking about security,
But wait, you
uh
asked me before we get into
oh,
that. You asked me what we've
oh,
been up to this week, and
oh, okay.
I have been because it's Q1 is almost over.
I know.
I've been getting
Crazy.
mentally prepared for the next quarterly planning because
Mm,
I've been kind of like shiny object syndrome and putting off
okay.
doing the stuff that I need to do. So that's been this week. I've been starting to think about, okay, I
Hey,
really need to get it together this coming quarter.
it's funny you mention that because I
Mm,
actually took 2 days off this week just to I was reassessing things to try and figure
Slacker.
out what I wanted to do.
wow.
Well, I also wanted a break, so screw
I'm
you.
kidding. I'm
I know,
kidding.
I know. I did finish a book though, which was really good in those 2 days,
Oh
which was
my
awesome.
goodness. Talking about finishing books, I know this is a whole bunch of segues and stuff, but we haven't talked
It's
in a
all
while.
good.
Uh,
I'll talk about
so
Brotato in a second.
okay,
That's
great.
good.
Yeah, let's
Do
get to
that.
Rotato. So, anyways, science fiction books. Like Danny and I talk about this series called The Expanse, which is awesome. And so I
Yeah.
prompted ChatGPT suggesting that The Expanse is like the ultimate in science fiction. Like make a list of 40 books from the
Oh
beginning of science
man.
fiction all the way up through The Expanse that like span the whole time period since when science fiction started. And dude, it made a seriously cool list. And I'm going to share it with you, Danny, because I know you would enjoy some of these books.
No,
But I
dude, yeah.
started reading the first one. It's from like the 1920s or 1930s, and it's like
Dude.
crazy.
Oh, dude, some of the
Damn.
classic sci-fi is really good. My problem is whenever I do this list, I'm like, oh, I read all of these already.
Yeah.
Dude,
It's
I
hard to
don't
find
know.
them.
Like, reading very long. I'm not a nonfiction reader in general. Like, I just like reading, or I'm sorry, I'm not a fiction reader. I am a nonfiction reader
Yeah, yeah, you like
in
reading real.
general.
It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's
And
different.
when I see people
I'm
read
not a
those, like,
fiction reader. I'm a non-reader.
Yeah.
yeah,
I
I'm
just
not a
don't read.
fiction or a nonfiction reader. I'm just a non-reader.
I guess I
No,
like,
but
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
when I see people read those books that are like this thick, my eyes glaze over. Like I'm like, there's no way I could ever
It
read
used
that.
to
Think of it
see
like
here's
this.
it
I was
used
gonna
to
say
be
like,
impressive back in the day when you had paper books.
yeah,
Now when you're reading on a Kindle, nobody knows you're reading a book
Yeah.
this thick. But like
yeah.
back in the day, you'd be carrying it around and like you literally had to like hold your hand this big to
You have
Yeah.
read
like a
it.
backpack just for the book. No, I was
Dude,
gonna say like I like fiction and nonfiction. I like reading a lot, and I just happen to like reading a lot. But I think I also
nerd.
like I choose to do it more than like watching TV and playing video games. Like that's another form of
Yeah,
relaxation. So it's all that's all it is. It's just like a
I
way to
get that.
relax and like
Yeah.
it's kind of
Mhm.
and to me it's a
Yeah.
lot like video games, especially like the sci-fi and stuff. It feels like that because you're like you're from that perspective.
Dude, like our 15-year-old, she's in her school. They're reading The Count of Monte Cristo. And I'm like, there's no way I would ever read that or be able to read that. I think I would
I
get
know
three
schools
pages in and
pick
be
the
like,
most boring books ever.
Yeah.
Well, you know what
Like
the problem is?
terrible
Yeah.
books.
She's struggling. I mean, she's
Well,
an avid reader, but she's like, this is so boring. I hate
it's because
this.
it's
Like,
not
this
something
is,
she's interested in. You gotta,
yeah,
and I never understood why they don't just let kids pick books that they actually are interested in, that are of a certain level. Be like, you have to pick a book of this level, I have to approve it, but like something you want, instead of like everybody has to
yeah,
read this.
yeah.
Hmm. But then the
Anyway, I think
teacher
we should get
wouldn't
back
know
to,
if, yeah, the
Yeah.
teacher wouldn't know when they write a report. If, yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, so
Anyway,
what's the
we should get
topic
back to
today?
coding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right?
Speaking of
Yeah.
security, like a while ago, the topic today is Git and GitHub. What are they? How to use them? Why they're helpful? And most importantly, how to keep yourself safe on these. Because believe it or not, they're an amazing tool, but they open you up to some vulnerabilities as a developer. And I think it's worthwhile explaining some of these vulnerabilities just to
There's
keep
risks from
yourself
several different
safe.
areas too. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that I'm thinking of even now that
Same
I
here.
think you need to be aware of as a developer, especially a junior developer, and especially a junior developer going out there and applying for jobs, because believe it or not,
There's scams, dude,
that's
everywhere.
one of the easiest ways to scam
Yeah.
people, unfortunately, is with jobs. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what Git is, what GitHub is, how they, find their place in the world of coding, and then how to keep yourself secure. So
All right.
with that, anyone want to explain what Git is?
Yeah. Sure. Why not? Git's version control. It's all it is. It's just basically to track think of it like it's just a way to track your progress and to keep account
Yeah.
of what changes you've made in a project so you can go forward so you can roll back or save your work. And GitHub is just an online cloud version of that essentially, managed by Microsoft that allows you for free, but you can it allows you to collaborate with others. It allows you to make changes to your code, it allows you to track those changes, to roll back, to make branches for features, things like this. So it's a very good tool, and it's one everyone that's a developer should be using because I think it's the most widely used option of those various things. It's a very simple explanation, but
Now,
I
if
mean,
now if
man,
you're looking for an even simpler explanation, if you've ever played Zelda Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, and you do
there
a
you go.
manual save, that's essentially like
yeah,
committing and pushing your stuff to GitHub. And then you
Yeah.
can go back to, because in Zelda you have multiple saves you can go back to. So let's say, you save something, but then you really want to go back a couple saves ago, you can do that, and you can do that with GitHub.
it's a good way to think
Yeah.
about it. It's like a game, right? It allows you to try things out, test things, to create things without breaking the whole project, right? Or
Talking about trying things out, you can also make a branch. So, like, let's say
yeah,
you wanted to test something out, you didn't know if it was going to work. You could just say, hey, this is a test
Mm,
branch. We're going to see
mm-hmm.
if we can make this thing. And if we can't, you just throw it away.
the
Yeah.
good thing I will say though
Revert
with
back
Git
to
and
the good
GitHub,
code.
they are essential to know for developers, and new developers should start using them as soon as possible. But there's tons of great like top commands that you need to know, sheets. There's tons of like AI is very helpful
Yeah.
with it. And really, as a new developer, you don't need to know a ton of commands, just really like a handful. You need to know how to create repos, to push to them, to save your stuff, to create a new branch. And as you go, you can learn more and more,
So,
complicated ones.
it is
Yeah.
important to know the difference between Git and GitHub.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say
So,
that.
Git is a local save on your computer.
You
Hmm?
install
But
Git on your computer locally, yeah.
exactly. And so it's saving everything on your computer. But what happens if, you spill something on your computer and you corrupt the hard drive or
Your
somebody steals
dog
your
eats your
computer,
homework.
dog eats your
Yeah,
computer. Yeah, something like
it
that.
happens
Yeah.
all the time.
Then you could lose it. But that's where GitHub comes in because GitHub is an online cloud repository where you can just
Yeah.
store your stuff. And
So
then if you lose your computer, you can just get a new one and pull whatever you're working on to your computer.
Yeah.
yeah, I think you make a good point because uh this I think one of the things that most developers get hung up on when they're first learning about Git and GitHub is the difference between the two because they are distinctly different, right? Git is locally on your machine, so it's like you're saving, but you're just saving it on your computer, whereas
Literally into
GitHub,
the project folder that you're working in.
yeah, like
Like,
it's literally just like in another folder. And what's important here is that you're not just saving it like, and I know you mentioned this, but like you're not just saving it at the point that you're at. You can do multiple saves as you code and step back to any point in time, right? So after you implemented a feature, after you add a new page or something, whatever. Um, but yeah, importantly, that's only on your local machine. But what's really nice is Git also connects to your GitHub account, your personal GitHub account, which I do recommend if you're a new developer to do that as soon as possible, right? Get yourself a GitHub account. It's 100% free. You just have to sign up with an email address. But it's
It's
really important that
basically
you
like your
do because,
portfolio too. It's a
yeah,
great resource. Like, yeah.
it's a portfolio, but it shows not only what projects you've coded, but what your history of coding has looked like because it has a commit graph that shows every commit you've ever made over time and when you made that. So that, when you go to apply for a job, the first thing they're going to ask you is, can I see your GitHub? Because they want to see like how long have you been coding? How many projects have you built? Right. And so one of the cool things too is with GitHub, it stores your code in the cloud, which means you can access it anywhere you want. You could be on grandma's computer, you could be on your friend's
I was just gonna
computer.
say actually, that's helped me a couple of times where like I've been away
Yeah.
from my laptop, thought of something because you're always thinking about
Yeah.
this stuff to solve a problem, and I didn't want to just type. It's like too long to type in your phone, so I just pulled the repo down, installed real quick, and then
Yep.
do it, make the change, commit, and you're done.
Yeah,
It's
it's
great.
awesome. I mean, you could literally be on a public library computer and start coding that
Yeah.
quickly.
But
Go ahead, Randall.
we are talking a little bit about security, and one of the
Hmm.
most curious things that boggles my mind about Git is they will push your public email address anytime you commit something.
Yeah.
They'll use your whatever email address you sign up with, and they'll publish that email address with your commit, which
Yeah.
Yeah.
doesn't make too much sense from a security standpoint, especially when people use you know, important email addresses. So this is
Yeah.
Yeah.
one of the most important things you can do. One of the best things you can do to begin with is you can just search for setting your commit email address, and there's a whole GitHub document on it on how to do it because GitHub will give you a random email address, and you can go into your settings and you can get this random email address, and then you can use that to set your commit email address. So that way, anytime you push anything, it'll use a random address.
So, since you're our security expert on staff, why is that important? Why do I care if my email address is already out there a ton? Why do I care that it's on GitHub?
So because it can be scraped very easily, but here's the thing. So like the email address by itself isn't that bad.
Hmm.
But when people want to let's say you become a developer, okay?
Yeah.
You're going to be working for this company that's going to have a lot of resources. They're going to have intellectual property, they're going to have all types of technology assets, computers, different things like that, insider knowledge, different stuff like this that's important to keep within the company. Well, when
Yeah.
you're a developer, you have access to a lot of those things. And if somebody has your email address, particularly your private email address that you think is generally pretty private, because you really only
Mm,
use it for like banking and GitHub, and then
yeah.
all of a sudden that's
Hmm.
that email address is public knowledge, someone can do what's called phishing, where they send you a fake email that looks incredibly realistic,
Yeah.
and they'll just put a malicious link in there that'll take you to a site that looks very similar to your bank to log into, and you'll click
Yeah.
that and you'll enter your password, and then they have your password and login information for the bank, and possibly any like tokens or security things for getting you to log into your bank in the future. So it can be somewhat dangerous from the phishing aspect. And the thing is,
Interesting.
like, a lot of people are like, well, I would never fall for phishing. And
Yeah.
everybody falls for phishing. Security
Everyone does.
experts
Yep.
fall
And
for
here's the
phishing.
thing
Everybody
too,
does. That's the
right?
funny
Is
thing,
like
right? They
I
always
think
say
I
that.
think it's easy to think of, oh, I'll never fall for phishing if people have one singular piece of data like your email address. But if somebody's scraping your email from GitHub, then they're gonna have a lot more information about you. They're gonna know what all your projects are built with, like what tech stack. So they might be able to say, like, hey, they have a Firebase account. Maybe I should send them a phishing email from Firebase or from wherever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they can also start to check into other things and start to figure out way more than just your email address, right? From that
Yeah.
Well,
information.
Build a
so that's
profile.
an interesting thing is that you can go to a website, haveibeenpwned.com, and it'll
Hmm.
tell you if your email address has ever been part of a security breach. And so this is where the danger comes in because hackers are generally lazy because we're just going for the lowest
You could
hanging
say that
fruit.
about everybody, probably.
Yeah,
I know, right? Yeah.
it's true about everyone.
But generally just going for the lowest hanging fruit, which
Yeah.
in most cases is the people reusing passwords and usernames. So if you go to Have I Been Pwned, you can see if your information is part of a security breach. And if you use a password in multiple different places, you're at risk because they can go and very inexpensively buy these things on the dark web, and then they can use them. Basically, they just spray them at every
Yeah.
social media login, at every banking login, at everything. They just try whatever email addresses and passwords, and eventually some of them will work.
Well, you know what's crazy
Yeah.
too? They've gotten more sophisticated too in these attacks. Like I was watching a thing on it was a new one that came out after the pandemic. It was based in text messages and email. But they basically intentionally send like a wrong text message or wrong email to use, like knowing that they didn't know the person. But the whole
Yeah.
point was to get a conversation going. And
I
they were
get
looking
those
for
all the
lonely
time,
people. Yep, I
like
get them too all the time.
nonstop.
Where it's like,
Yeah.
hey, I forgot this, or like I'm looking for
Yeah. I
some
left my
whatever. It was
keys at your
something
house.
something benign, yeah. And they want
Yeah.
you to text back and be like, oh, sorry, wrong number. And then they'll wait a while, then they'll start a conversation. And it's this huge scam that goes on for like months.
It's
Basically,
crazy.
it's really messed up, yeah. But just you have to be
Mhm.
careful for everything now. And as being a developer, I think to the point, you have to be even more careful because you're at greater risk in some cases.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I mean, as a developer, you're generally going to be handling sensitive data too. I mean, once you start working on projects,
Oh, yeah.
anytime that somebody authenticates into anything, basically, you have some sensitive data of theirs. You have their email address, you have their name potentially.
You
There's
might have
enough
their
there
card
to like,
information if you're
yeah,
doing
like you have
payments. You
a
might
lot of
have like,
stuff.
yeah.
So you do have to be pretty careful
If
with
it's a
that. So
business, you could have their sensitive, intellectual property, their data, it's like, yeah.
yeah. So if you're watching this on Facebook currently, in the live, I dropped a link to the GitHub document there about how to change your email address. And Danny also dropped a link to the GitHub cheat sheet so you can see some basic commands. And I want to talk about that in a second here about like the main commands that you're going to need. But I just did want to mention briefly like what it's going to look like, right? So normally when you make a commit, it would say like your email address directly in that commit. But now once you go through this process of setting your commit email to this obfuscated one, you're going to see some sort of like a referral email. Like it's going
It
to be
even
like
tells you actually in your settings
some
when you change it,
yeah.
it'll say like now
It's
we're going to use
basically just
this
some
weird.
forwarding email that's
Yeah,
some junk. Like it's not important. So
it's like a bunch of random numbers and nonsense, and
yeah.
yeah.
So that's what it's going to look like. And so I wanted to say this, like, back to the GitHub cheat sheet. When I remember when I got, first into software development and people were like, hey, you need a Git and a GitHub and whatever. And they
It
were
was
teaching
overwhelming at
me about,
first, right?
yeah, it's very overwhelming, right? There's a lot of like obscure terms that people use, like branches and checking things out, committing, staging. And
Merging,
so
pulling.
merging, pulling, pull requests, right? There's a lot of like confusing things there. So I want to maybe see if we can like shed some light on some of those things for new developers. So let's say I am brand new to GitHub, never done this before. How do I like do my first commit?
If it's like
Well,
if
I
it's
would
a
say before you do your first commit, you should, uh, well, you'll probably have to initialize a repository, but also
yeah,
checking the status. So if you haven't initialized a repository doing something like git init, but if you
Yeah.
have already, and when you use GitHub, it actually gives you really nice instructions for how to set it all up. Like you can
it
Yeah.
just
does.
copy and paste it. But then
Yep.
once you do that, something that I always do before I commit is I do git status just to make sure that anything's
Mm-hmm.
changed. Because you're only going to be able to commit stuff if you've changed the code.
Yeah,
And
let me
so,
let me
Well,
back up
that's the
just one step
yeah.
because if somebody's not familiar with Git, they may not understand like these commands that you're
yeah, that's a
saying.
good point.
So in Git, basically, remember, Git is tracking your code base, right? So it's seeing like what changes have been made over time and saving those in like a local folder. And then
All right.
GitHub is the remote one. One sec,
Yeah, they're
Danny.
just
And
and you
and
connect them, right?
yeah,
They're just logged in, you
yeah,
connect them
they're
together. Yeah.
connected. They like reference each other.
You can
Um,
actually, so if you have Git installed, you can look at the manual for Git by in command line typing man Git, two
mm,
words, man space Git, and that'll give you the manual for Git. So it'll tell you
that's a
a lot
good
of the
point.
different commands you can use. And I just did it for the first time. I've never done it before. But it's funny because it says name Git, the stupid content tracker.
That is funny. I never
Yeah,
saw that before.
Yeah.
yeah.
So what Randall was saying before, he was sort of throwing out there some Git commands, and importantly, whenever you're working with Git, you're basically working not whenever, but for the most part, you're working in the terminal, right? That's how Git is designed to be used. There are VS Code extensions that have sort of like a visualization of Git and like buttons to click, but you're a developer, you need to start learning the terminal, so use it in the terminal, right? So these commands that Randall's mentioning are commands that you would type into the terminal, and then you have to do them either in a certain sequence to do an actual commit, or the first one that you mentioned was git status, and so that's going to tell you the status of your project, right? It'll show you which files are being tracked, which ones are not being tracked, which are staged, and so I know we're throwing out a lot of words, so like what is the process for that first commit? Do you want to go through that maybe?
Yeah, so
I
I do
can too. I don't mind.
git status, git
Yeah.
add dot,
So
git commit
Git
dash
status is
m.
going to tell you like it's going to shoot out a list of like, okay, what files are being tracked, what's not being tracked, and what's staged. Like basically just the status of your
Are
Git
there new changes, basically? Do
at
you have
that
anything
moment.
to commit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then so the next one you said was git add and period.
right.
So that one is to stage any new changes to your project. Okay. So this is, I think this hangs a lot
And
of people
staging
up.
means to get them ready to be committed.
Exactly. Right. So it's like, it's sort of like, hey, I'm collecting all these files, making sure that I want to save them. And then I can review them before I stage them or save them. And then I do the commit, which is actually the save. So, and what's cool is you can stage them and then you can like unstage them too if you're like, hey, I don't want that file. And so the command you said, git add period, that period means this entire folder that I'm currently in. So that means I'm staging any new change in the entire project folder. It's possible to also just stage individual files by doing git add and then the file name itself.
Or
But most
folders. Yeah,
commonly,
you can.
yeah, yeah, or folders. Most commonly, though, you're going to just see people do git add period because you want to obviously save all new changes and not have to type out each file. So, what next after
And
git
then
add?
git commit dash m, and then in quotes, a message that you want to remind you what this save is.
Ideally, a
Yeah,
clear message that explains what you're doing, like created this feature, added this
yeah.
thing, changed the
Not like
content
my
here.
save for.
Yeah. Or git commit 17.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
My
idea is
save
when you go
for, I
back
like
and
that
look at
one.
these, those messages will also be a guide to help you decide if you want to go backwards to which point,
Yeah.
right? Those
This
messages
is
help you understand that.
this is like a big hang up, I think, too, where like for junior developers, we're like, oh, I'll remember what I
Yeah,
committed in
right?
that commit. You won't. You won't at all. So because you're gonna go back and look at this probably sometime weeks, months down the road, and you want to know what exactly did I do on this commit? Because if you go back to it, you're basically erasing anything after it. So you want to make sure that you're going to the right commit.
And
So
then
after, yeah,
and then
go ahead.
if you have GitHub set up, after that you can do git push. And
Yeah.
generally, if you have it set up, that'll push it to GitHub, so it'll be in a cloud repository as opposed to just on your computer.
Yeah. So when you did that git commit dash M, that's saying I'm committing these files. The dash M means I'm adding a commit message. And then in quotes, you add that message, like added, I don't know, submit button. And and then once you commit that, that's committed locally, importantly, right? That's only on your local machine. And then the next step, what you just said, is git push, or there's longer versions of that if you want to push to certain branches, but essentially git push. And if your local version is tracking your remote version, then it will push upstream,
And
right?
that's
Meaning
a
it'll push your code to the cloud.
And that's a good practice for new developers, especially when you're starting with Git, like that, or starting with Git and GitHub. That's one of the things that I did was when you commit something and then push it to GitHub, it'll show up on your contribution graph. And this is
Yes.
something that people want to see that you're actively contributing to GitHub. So it's good to get in the habit of committing things and pushing them to GitHub. That way you'll have lots of stuff on your contribution
It's
graph.
also helpful because then
So
you get into
Yeah.
small changes which is
Hmm.
a better method anyway to commit small changes rather than huge, huge blocks of code, right? You're
Exactly.
committing
Yes.
small incremental things.
And so one habit that's really good as a beginning developer is to start doing this regularly, not only so that you can learn GitHub, but also it'll help you out down the line because you'll be in the habit of doing it. You'll have a really long contribution graph already by the time you're doing anything meaningful. And so it really gets you in the habit of doing it. And then once you're comfortable doing this over again, over and over again, you're just going to be doing git status, git add dot, git
Yeah.
commit dash
Yeah.
m, git push. And you're just going to be doing that over and over and over again. And that'll become second hat. And then you can look into all these different things like checking out branches and doing all these other
Yeah.
things.
We gave you guys the cheat sheet and all too. Check that out. I would also recommend the docs, but we have a few minutes left. We should talk about some of these security issues too, since
Yeah,
that
so
was the
that's
focus.
what I wanted to say is we sort of, got to the point of okay, so we've done a commit, we pushed it to the cloud. Now, importantly, I think we should talk about two files, the .git and the .git ignore. Because what we just talked about, if you just follow those directions over and over, eventually you'll make a big mistake and probably expose more security issues for your project. So, can one of you guys explain what the .git folder is and the .git ignore folder and where I might find those? And if
So the
not,
You're not
dot,
going to
I'll
find
answer
them because
this.
they're hidden.
yeah. Well, the dot you have to have, yeah, you have to have hidden files viewable in your directory, which you should have. You should have anyway if you're doing development work. But
Yeah.
the dot git folder is your local. That's basically tracking your local your local changes. That's your local
Yep.
Git repo for that project.
So
The
if you want to
dot
know,
git
like, hey, where's the files that I'm just saving? That's where it is in
That's where they
.git.
go. Yeah.
Yeah.
They go in .git. That keeps track of the changes. The .git ignore is a file that allows you to specify that Git should ignore certain files in this directory when you're making changes. Traditionally, this would be things like if you're working with frameworks, it would be like modules or packages because you don't want to commit these huge, huge amounts of data to the cloud or to your repo. The other thing it would be too is
Yeah.
like .env.local. So it would be, your security keys, your API keys, things like this that are private that you
Yep.
don't want exposed to the world. And actually, GitHub, if you do expose those, will warn you and give you warnings and also sometimes disallow that project to continue because you've made a mistake and you need to clean
Yeah.
out that stuff. But the git ignore is
Yes.
crucial because that's where you can put in like ignore.env, local.env, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. David and Bryce in the comments, right on. Don't hard code your API keys. And yeah, you want to
Yeah.
protect that .env.local. So yeah, so you make a good point here, right? Is eventually you're going to get to more advanced projects where you have API keys. Like, you need access to third-party APIs or your own APIs. And those keys are basically money, right? Because if you're using a third-party service, like let's say you're using OpenAI's API to interact with ChatGPT, if you expose your API key, which you can ask Randall, there's plenty of those exposed
Well,
on GitHub.
so there's a guy on GitHub. His name is Win3ZZ. That's his username,
Hmm.
WIN3ZZ. And he has a file. It's a just a GitHub gist, but it's GitHub leaked API keys and secrets. And there's
Yeah.
basically there's a couple search queries that you would add, and you can get OpenAI API keys, you can get GitHub OAuth API
Mind
keys, you can
you,
get Slack tokens, Google
just
API keys.
disclaimer here, this
I'm
is like for educational purposes. If you do use any of these, you're committing a felony, so don't do that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I'm not gonna paste a link to that in the comments. If you want, you can look it up yourself. Like Russell said, there's no and again, not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer, so clearly consult your own lawyer before you do this. But using these in a search query, there's nothing wrong with that. But abusing those keys, absolutely, you will
Yeah.
wind up in prison.
And remember,
And
these keys are linked to
yeah,
your personal account. So like if you have API keys, you're paying for that use, that service,
Right.
which means your card's information is linked to it and some card information, which means, if somebody else gets a hold of it, they can make calls against your account and drain your account. So
Yeah.
it's important to have, it's important to do a lot of things. I think with APIs, it's important to also set limits so you can see if you should spikes, things like that, because that's helpful just on
Yes.
that end to know what's going on. It's also important to protect this information. And this is also true of
Yeah.
passwords, anything else, right? You don't want to commit anything to the repo that's going to be exposed security risks.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to mention, so basically, in order to protect yourself, what you want to do is there is a file that once you initialize Git, it usually appears in your project folder, but if you don't have it, you can just create it and it's .git ignore, all one
I'll put it
word.
in a comment.
And yeah, and basically any file or folder that you put in that file, like you type out, will be ignored by Git when it does commits. And you want to make sure that this is true, like when you do your Git status or, checking like what stage. Obviously, the first few times you might want to check that you're doing this correctly. But anything that you put in there will be ignored. So the ones that you're going to see a lot are number one, node
Bryce makes
modules.
a
If
good
you're
point as well too. Like if you make a mistake and accidentally commit, you're still exposed because that's still
Yes,
up there. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
So
and I
what do
was
you
going to
do in
say
those
that
situations?
Oh,
you
good one.
destroy the repository is the best
Yeah.
thing you can do. So
Just
let
start
me
that over
explain
from
And
that
there.
and you
because
can get a new
if you're
API
new,
key.
Yeah. That is
That's
yes,
also
also
true.
another. That's
that's
probably
another option.
a safer
Cleaner
bet is
one.
to just get a brand new API
Yeah.
key, delete the old one, and that way you're
So
not
let
at
me
risk.
explain that because it's unless you understand what we're talking about, that may seem a little vague. So when you remember that when we're making Git commits, we're tracking commits over time. So and when I push that to the cloud, I'm not just pushing the last commit, I'm pushing the entire chain of commits, all of those commits and all of the data that I've committed in those. And so basically, what Bryce is trying to say here is if you accidentally commit an API key early on and then later add that to git ignore and you're like, oh, I'm safe because it's being ignored now. The reality is that API key was committed at some previous commit. And when you push that, you're pushing everything. I can see like on GitHub, you can see every commit and the code, what it looked like at every commit. So even if you delete it off the last one or anything like that, it's still buried in your commit log. And so what Randall said is, how do you like what do you do in that situation if you accidentally do that? Because it does happen. And as Danny mentioned, GitHub does warn you, but it doesn't warn you before or during
No.
the push. It warns you after it because they're just checking if there's API keys like being uploaded. And so you'll actually get a notification like well after the fact, a few hours later, that's like your API key is exposed. And so there's two solutions. One is you delete the entire repository from GitHub or like rebase your code, which is a huge nightmare to do if you're going back to do that. The second option, which is much cleaner, is you say, screw it, that API key is going to live there forever, but I'm going to change the API key, basically delete that one so it doesn't work anymore. So even if somebody finds it, it's useless essentially. It can't do anything. So I think that's a really clean option. Unfortunately, you're still exposing that, and you might get emails from GitHub until the end of time. But
And David makes a good point in the comments talking about the difference between public and private repositories.
yeah,
Sometimes it can be scary, the things that you can do security wise with GitHub.
Yeah.
And it may be beneficial until you're more comfortable with it just to create private repositories. Because your commits in them still contribute to your
yeah,
contribution graph, but
yeah,
you won't be able to search for any of this stuff publicly.
and
And
that
if
And
is
you
as
if
what
another
you
as you
option.
I was
Mhm.
gonna say, as you go forward too, you're gonna be making mostly private repos because you're gonna be working on stuff that's for clients or for yourself that you don't
Yeah,
want everybody to have access to. So I think it's important to also keep that in mind that yeah, private's a good way to go at first, just because it is a level of protection if you don't know exactly what you're doing, or if you make a mistake, it's a little bit helpful there.
yeah, yeah, and you can always make a. Basically, what this means is private and public is a GitHub thing. It means like can public any person basically see your code. And
Yeah.
when you're starting out, like having public repos is good because you can show off your code, especially if you're looking for jobs. But that's another way to solve this issue. If you expose an API key, you can just make the whole repository private if you
Start out
can.
private and you can always go back and
Yeah,
make it public later. That's the other thing too. You can always change it to public after you're done and make sure everything's okay. Like you can
yeah,
that's a good option, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so
Cool.
yeah, I think we covered a bunch. There's way, way, way more that we could cover if we had hours and hours and hours to cover GitHub. But I would I would say this, if anybody is watching this and you're a new developer, the most important thing is to start using GitHub because it's something that takes a little bit of muscle memory to get used to. Even just those basic commit commands, there's like a couple of them. There's 3 different commands at least. And so having practice is going to benefit you a lot. So if you're brand new, if you don't have a GitHub, go out there, start learning about Git. There's plenty of like excellent YouTube videos that will break
Oh
down
yeah, and
every single
resources.
Git topic out there. And then make yourself a GitHub and start pushing code to it. And we say this inside the incubator, but and plenty of other developers say it, but commit early and often, right? Meaning create your code base, commit, add a small feature, commit, right? You want to do this frequently. It's sort of like what Randall was saying in the beginning. Like if you're playing Zelda and you want to be able to go back and like play whatever, if you just make one save in the beginning of the game and then 20 hours into the game, you only have 2 points to go back to when you first started or 20 hours into the game. If you commit every hour, then you have all these points where you can continue coding. And that's ideally what you want to do in terms of coding, right? You want to commit frequently so that you can jump back if you need to. Yeah. Anything else you guys want to
No,
add for Git and GitHub? I think that's a good
it's a good starter and it
once
covers some
over.
of the
Get
basic
yourself
stuff.
started, start working with it. And then when you're ready to, there's more advanced topics. There's ways. I mean, one of the benefits of Git is that uh, it allows for really, really powerful collaboration between developers too, right? So the for now when you're starting, use it to track your code, but in the future you can use it to collaborate and have multiple developers working on the same code base all at the same time, and that's when it gets really, really powerful, but also very confusing. So start with the basics and then work yourself up to it. I would say learn how to do basic commits, then maybe learn how to do branches, right? Because that's like sort of the next step. And branches just means you're tracking 2 different versions of your code at the same time. So adding complexity, but again, adding more power and features to that tool.
Yeah,
Cool. With
awesome.
that, thanks for hanging out. If you guys are in the incubator, we will be seeing you in about 20 minutes. Check the Telegram for the link to that. And with that,
All right.
enjoy your Saturday, everybody. Have a great day. And by the way, it's March 8th now
Ah,
at 9:37.
there we go.
Oh, thank goodness. I was curious for
All
the
right.
past 37
Yeah,
minutes what day and time.
now
All
you
right,
know.
fellas.
All right.